Good morning and welcome everyone to session 2, Economic Trends That Affect Your Business. My name is Walker French and I'm Assistant Director at B&V Capital Advisors, the investment banking subsidiary of Briggs & Veselka. Briggs & Veselka has a long-standing relationship with the Greater Houston Partnership, and we're happy to have Josh Pherigo back with us this year to provide an economic update on Houston. But before I turn it over to Josh, I just want to remind everyone that this and all the sessions today are eligible for CPE credits. All you need to do is answer the polling questions, and let's get our first one done right now. Okay, question 1. My company operates either locally, regionally, nationally, or internationally. And while everyone answers that question, I will go ahead and introduce our guest speaker. So Josh Pherigo is Director of Data Analytics at the Greater Houston Partnership, where he monitors Houston's economic and demographic trends with a focus on digital innovation, trade, and employment. He is a regular contributor to the partnership's monthly newsletter, Houston, the Economy at a Glance. Okay, let's take a quick look at the poll results for question 1. Okay, we have a good mix here, and looks like there are a lot of owners that operate businesses that operate regionally here. So that's a interesting piece to keep with us during our talk today. So, Josh, we're excited for your update on Houston, and thank you for joining us today.
Hey, thanks, Walker. I'm excited to be here. So this is an event I look forward to every year because it's nice to be able to share what's going on in the region. And this year in particular, I think everybody's very, very curious to know how we're kind of thinking about this and responding to the situation. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Okay, so let's get right into it. I work at the Greater Houston Partnership. That is a member-based organization for Houston. We represent the business community, and our mission really is quite simple. We're trying to make the region a better place to live, work, and grow a business. So we're trying to make Houston greater. It's right in the name. During the last 4 months, my department, the research department, has been very focused on trying to understand the implications of COVID on the region, trying to keep up with what's happening locally to the economy, and just monitoring activities. It's been a challenge. We've been finding new ways to measure that activity. We're finding that a lot of the government data sources that we like to use for key economic indicators fall short in this time when it comes to needing to know on even a weekly or a daily or any time period that's not monthly. So we found some new ways to track that. I'm going to go through some of those ways that we're tracking the activity. We have them on our website at the address you see here, houston.org/reopen-safely dashboard. This is a monitoring dashboard. I'm going to go through a few of the indicators we're looking at, but I would encourage anybody who's interested to go check it out. We update this on a weekly basis. And so the idea here is to give a sense of how the region's responding, how activity is responding, and we'll go through a few of these. But like I said, if you want to go check it out, there's more to see there. So where do we stand with the Houston case count? It's important to understand how COVID is affecting the region before we can kind of talk about the economic implications. So as of our most recent update this week, Houston has seen around 100,000, just under 100,000, 99,000 COVID cases confirmed in the region, and just about 1,800 deaths. To put that in perspective, across the United States, COVID is on track to be the third leading cause of death in 2020, behind heart disease and cancer. So there'll be more people that die of COVID this year than die of accidents of any kind. It's a pretty startling statistic. So it kind of is good to remember why we're taking these extra precautions, why it's important to control the spread. The good news, or tepidly good news for Houston, is that our hospitalizations most recently have started to come down. So it looks like we may have hit a peak in the early part of July, and the rate of new daily hospitalizations in the region is starting to decline. We get these numbers straight from the Texas Medical Center, and so we just pull their. They're doing a pretty good job of updating their numbers on a daily basis, and so we pull them right into our reporting. And so this at least is showing the initial signs of kind of a positive movement, although you can see that those numbers are still pretty high. So we'll go through some of these indicators of activity. These are some things that I mentioned we're tracking on the dashboard. The first one is, are people going into the office? Some of these, I think you'll get a sense as we go through this presentation here for the next 20 minutes that these trends are pretty drastic. So the line graphs we're going to be looking at, the bar graphs, they're going to be showing some dramatic jumps and spikes and dips that we're not used to seeing in a typical economic presentation, but this is not a typical time. So you can see this right here. We went to Houston First, which controls a lot of the parking in downtown, and we've been getting them to send us the numbers that they have for total parking transactions in downtown. And so we like this as a good indication of the number of people who are going to work. You see that in a typical time, 35,000 transactions is typical. We are down, and we've been hovering at around 10,000 for quite some time. And so you can see just how that activity has stayed low. It's above the lowest point in early April of around 5,000, but it's still not returning. People are not heading back into the office. And then this is an indication of people staying at home. The thing to kind of note here is just what's typical is around that a little bit above 20%. And then we're kind of above that. This is from a source called Q by Q that tracks people's activity through their smartphones. And now we're looking at overall traffic volumes, people driving around. You can see that this is down, but it's down from what's typical by 12 percentage points, but it's up considerably from the very lowest point when people were just completely staying home and not going anywhere. People are starting to go places, they're just not, they're still socially distancing. The next one we're going to look at is restaurant activity. What I find really remarkable at this graph is just that flat 100% drop. That's the period where restaurants were closed down. And so we're looking at open table reservations in Houston, in the Houston region. And so restaurant activity was completely flat. And then when Governor Abbott's orders came out allowing restaurants to partially reopen, allowing patio service, you saw that activity jump back up. And then you saw a real big spike in June that has kind of dropped back down and has kind of stayed still significantly lower than, so people have not returned back to the restaurants in the way that, people are still socially distancing, people are still being careful, which is good. I'd like to see that. So we'll go through a little bit of the indications now that we're looking at locally. What is the activity like? Now let's see, you can see that people's activities have changed because of COVID, obviously, and those activity changes have serious implications for the global, national, and local economy. So I'll briefly touch on the global, then go into the national and talk for a little bit more of an extended period on the local implications. So globally, pretty drastic. The International Monetary Fund calls this a crisis like no other. They're projecting that in advanced economies, a shrinkage of 8 percentage points to advanced economies in their GDP in 2020. That recovery will begin in 2021 with a 4.8% increase in GDP. Overall, globally, it's around a 5% shrinkage in the economy. Compare that to the Great Recession, which was 0.1% contraction in 2009. So you can get a sense for the scale of the economic implications from this. IMF is saying that it's had a more negative impact than previously anticipated, and that the projection of the recovery will be more gradually than they anticipated. That may be more of a reflection on their early ability to forecast this. And here's what I mean by that. This is a slide I put together back in April when their initial projections of global GDP contraction were around 3%. And this is what it looks like when you update it. It just gets a little bit more severe, right? And so it's just a sign that even those early, very serious forecasts about how impactful COVID will be weren't even enough. They had to go back and revise it downward. So it's not necessarily getting better. It's actually slightly worse than what the IMF predicted. And here's just a look at kind of the areas of the world that are being most affected. It's what you would think. It's more of the advanced economies. So this is another indication of just kind of in perspective over the years, what has trade looked like. This is from the International Monetary Fund. And you can see the dip in 2009. Trade is very important to Houston's economy in particular because of our energy industry and the amount of exports and imports that we have sent through the port. And so you can see that the IMF was projecting that this downturn would mirror kind of the downturn that we saw in 2009. That has, for the most part, been the case. So trade has continued. This is a look at back in April, they put together a best case and a worst case scenario of what trade would do, global trade. The decline has been the steepest on record. Trade fell 18.5% in Q2 2020, which is actually better than their worst case projections. So things are bad, but they are not as bad as the IMF was projecting they could get. And so you can notice that yellow dotted line is our historic trend. And it looks like we will likely not get back to that growth rate until 2021 at the earliest, late 2021, and potentially even longer. It looks like the IMF and the World Trade Organization are slightly differing in how they anticipate us getting back to normal. So it could be a long tail here that we're dealing with. Nobody's really sure at this point. Looking closer at the U.S. economy, just taking a look at the numbers. So we had really good news in June, but let's put it in perspective. So June, we created 4.8 million jobs in a single month. But let's talk about what that means. So in April, we lost 20.8 million jobs. And so we've gained back in the last, in May and June, we've gained back about 7 million of those 22 million jobs, but it's not, we're still in the hole here. And so it's a pretty startling drop. You can see this as the cumulative job gains. We've just had steady growth since 2014 and even before that. And this is just kind of like showing the scale of the drop that we saw when the shutdown occurred. The increase is when restaurants and other retail service sector companies have opened back up and rehired. PPP helped with that, but we're still not where we need to be. It's basically wiped out all the gains that we've seen since 2014. And here's a look at the initial claims for benefits. You can see that they spiked in late March, and they've just kind of been slowly tapering off as people continue to lose their jobs. Putting that into perspective with the most recent economic crisis that we're aware of, the Great Recession, you can see that continuing claims for benefits peaked at 6.5 million, and we are close to 3 times that at this point. Really, economists are very clear that the recovery is going to be dependent on containing the spread of this pandemic in the U.S. The Wall Street Journal does a nice poll monthly. 91% of the economists that were polled in that survey, their economic forecast survey, said that the recovery depends on containing the virus. And right now, the virus is not contained. So any projections that are made kind of have a big asterisk by it that it relies on the virus being contained so that that growth can really start to continue or really begin. So what does this mean for the local economy? How are we sitting right now in Houston? So initial claims for unemployment benefits in the Houston region started going up in mid to late March and reached a peak in early March at 76,000 claims, and they've stayed up ever since then as people lose their jobs. Typical is what you see on the first two bars right there, around the 4,000 mark, and so we typically see around 4,000 unemployment claims every month. You can, if you track this bar graph back a few years, you would see that staying pretty steady. And so you can see that we're much above that right now. Continuing claims for the whole Gulf Coast region, this is more of an indication of like longer term type benefit situation. This is putting it in perspective. The last 3 months of data that we have, April through June, versus some of the other major economic blips that we've seen locally. And just, the current crisis really dwarfs the other economic downturns that we had. I think Hurricane Ike, Hurricane Harvey, it's just not comparable what we've seen. We have about 265,000 unemployed. And these are some of the layoffs we're seeing. We're tracking layoffs in our office. Our department's tracking layoffs. And this is just a sampling of the companies in the Houston region that have announced layoffs since March. The good news, as the initial phase of reopening gave way into the second phase of reopening, and as some businesses have been able to come back, we have seen some rehiring occur. And so we'll go through kind of what the industries look like in terms of the peak loss, and then what jobs have been gained back thus far in the region. So as you would expect, hotels, bars, restaurants, these businesses were closed. And so they saw the biggest impact initially to jobs. And so that 110,000 jobs that were lost with hotels, bars, hospitality sector, we've seen a good amount of those come back when some of those businesses were allowed to reopen. So you can see 64,000 have already returned. So that's good. What's not so good is that it's likely that 46,000, if it had, those jobs haven't come back so far, even though hotels, bars, restaurants have been allowed to, for the most part, reopen, although bars are still not reopening. We're not as optimistic that we're going to immediately get a return on those 46,000. And so it's likely that the red that you're starting to see right here is going to take a longer time to come back than that initial gain that we saw. So it is possible that these are going to be longer term trends that are going to take a while to recoup. Let's look at some other industries. So the scaling is somewhat off here, just to want to be able to show you clearly what the numbers are. I'll just go through some of these. So we've seen admin jobs coming back. Some real estate jobs were lost. Although these are much smaller numbers than the previous slide. Educational services haven't returned yet. Obviously, as schools have not returned yet. So we'll get a better idea in the next few months on that. And then notice the government bar here. We put this together, and this is a reflection of, I think, like April time period. And then when we've updated it in the last 3 months, it's actually gotten a little bit steeper, the losses in government. So that's an area where government has actually continued to shed jobs there. So how long will it take to recover some of those maybe longer term job losses? It's hard to know. We obviously gained back 133,000 jobs as businesses were allowed to reopen. That indicated that some of the losses were because of just temporary closures of the business. And when they were allowed to reopen, they were allowed to rehire. and that came back. The issue is going to be that 217,000 jobs that have not come back. Some of those are energy jobs. Some of those are more systemic problems in the economy. So here's a look at, well, if we grew at some of the longer term rates that we have historically grown at, it could be 3, it could be 4 years before we recover some of those. If we have very good growth, we'll call this a best case scenario, it could be 2 years to recover some of these jobs. It all depends on containing the pandemic so that businesses are allowed to reopen. So I want to give a quick update on some things that could help to push that timeline up, the things that could help cause a faster recovery in the economy, and that's going to be innovation. So when we talk about innovation, we're talking about the discovery and commercialization of new technologies, new life science developments, things that can be scaled rapidly. In Houston, we have had a growing tech sector over the last few years. This is an important element of our economy because it helps to diversify away from energy, which is not going to be having the kind of growth that we've been able to rely on it for the past 30 years or so. And so that growth is going to have to come from somewhere else. Digital technology is one of those places that it could come from. And when I talk about digital technology, I also am going to lump in there life science and biotechnology and the developments that are coming out of the Texas Medical Center. So some of the big numbers to know about, the number of professionals in our economy right now who have these digital tech and these engineering and these math and science skills, it's about 235,000 people. And we'll talk about where that puts us in just a second. This portion of our economy accounts for $28 billion toward our GDP. Last year, we received $600 million in venture capital funding to startups in the region. This is an image from a map that the University of Houston's put together. It's a great resource. It's called the Tech Map. And this is a look at some of the venture-backed tech startups in the region. We have over 500 VC-backed tech startups, and any one of these could become a household name or produce an innovation that could really change an industry. So how good is the 235,000? Well, Houston gets a little bit of a bad rap because we have kind of a perception problem that we're not as innovative or as tech-centric as places like Austin. But we do have tech talent in the city. We have the 12th most tech workers in the United States. When I talk about Houston, I mean the whole metro area, the MSA. The thing about our innovation, part of our story to understand when it comes to tech, a lot of our innovations have been driven by our institutions. Think NASA, think some of our major energy companies in the region. We tend to have we tend to not do a lot of the smartphone technology. We're not developing apps in our spare time here. We're working on big systemic fundamental challenges in Houston. So it's a lot of our entrepreneurs, our tech entrepreneurs tend to be older. They tend to be mid-career. They tend to come out of corporate America. They tend to come out of NASA, things like that. Think about Compact, one of our best startup stories ever. 3 engineers coming out of Texas Instruments, right? Deciding mid-year we want to start our own thing, and they built a computer. This is the kind of history we have here. So it helps to tell that story to understand about our startups. Startup funding is doing quite well. We're having the best venture capital growth that we've seen really in our history. 2019 was a great year, and 2020 is actually shaping up to be a very good year for venture capital despite all the challenges with COVID. So what are those industries that we're focusing on? What is the technology that we're good at here? A lot of it is related to energy. So you can see that out of every 100 VC deals, about 18 of them are going to oil and gas. About 17 of them are going to life sciences. And then we kind of get into the software as a service, some industrials, clean technology. You can see just by the nature of these industries, they are beefy challenges that are taking a lot of intellectual capital to solve. Oncology is becoming a really important component of our innovation ecosystem. All of these areas have the ability to create hundreds and thousands of jobs. So then this is a little visual that I wanted to put together to show a little bit how our ecosystem is a little bit different than the rest of the countries, and in particular, the other two major Texas cities in Dallas and Austin. You can see that Dallas and Austin here, when it comes to, I've put in the pink is kind of like what I'm calling the footprint. This is a star plot showing the same information that you saw in the previous graph, but like highlighting our strengths by industry. You can see that oil and gas, life sciences, oncology, the US, Dallas, Austin, they're all somewhat similar in that their focus is really on software as a service when it comes to what's receiving venture capital. They're not as focused on energy. They're not as focused on life science as a percentage of their overall tech space. This is just something to understand about Houston. That may be why we're not doing as well on some of the more like well-known tech lists, things like that, best place to start a tech company. But there is innovation happening here. So that's kind of what I had prepared for you. I'm excited to hear from Walker in terms of a little bit more about the private equity landscape and about the mergers and acquisitions that are taking place. You can see this is one final graph that I had just showing a little bit of the trends that we're seeing. And you can see that SaaS, while it's not the most important component of our overall tech space, it is growing, and so that's a good trend that we want to see. So yeah, I'm gonna stop sharing here. I think we have a second poll question. I'll go ahead and ask the poll question. COVID-19 is impacting my business either very negatively, slightly negatively, no impact, slightly positively, or positively. And Walker, I will turn it over to you.
All right, thanks, Josh. That was great. And by the way, at the end, we're going to have hopefully a little bit of time for Q&A. So, Josh presented some great data. Everyone, make sure you use the Q&A button that's there at the bottom of Zoom and tee up some great questions for Josh based on all of his presentation. So we'll have some time here at the end to kind of ask Josh a few more questions. So I'll follow up Josh's Houston data with some trends in mergers and acquisitions. And here's a quick outline of the information that I'll touch on. We'll be taking a look at long-term trends to help us get context for the changes in Q2. So this data, a lot of it goes back to 2010, some of it to 2007. So we'll get to see a lot of context for these changes that happened just now in Q1 and Q2 of 2020, pre-COVID, post-COVID, and as a result of shutdown. We'll be looking at these as a brief outline: U.S. M&A activity, cross-border M&A activity, U.S. M&A activity composition by the dollar volume and the count of transactions, industry composition by dollar volume and count, private equity transaction types, the private equity capital overhang, and then we'll share a recent example from our practice at BVCA, and then important considerations from a buyer's perspective during this time for M&A transactions. And one caveat before we jump in, we are very early in the data collection process about the impact of COVID-19 and the shutdown on the M&A market. In fact, our preferred data source, our favorite data source that focuses on transactions that are under 50 million, has not yet reported their second quarter data. And so we don't have an update yet on important terms in M&A transactions, including indemnification caps and escrows. Will definitely be impacted as part of the shutdown, as part of ongoing challenges. So all that said, let's take a look at M&A transactions broadly in the U.S. and how they've been impacted by the pandemic. Next slide, please. So what's the context? Well, as you probably know, excuse me, we're at the tail end of the longest economic expansion in U.S. history, and mirroring that expansion in mergers and acquisitions, we've basically had 10 years of what we would consider increasingly a seller's market with pricing and terms increasingly in the seller's favor on average. Actually, this needs to be the previous slide. Somebody can switch it. Okay, thank you. Here's the tough headline. In the second quarter of 2020, transaction dollar volume is down 41% versus Q1, and the number of transactions closed is down 24% in terms of count. Since 2008 through 2010, that's a significant departure from growth that we've seen in M&A transactions, both in volume and the count of transactions. Okay, next slide. Okay, you can also see a significant pullback in cross-border M&A activity. It's becoming even more pronounced. There was a pullback in 2019 for international and cross-border M&A activity in the U.S., but we, year-to-date 2020, have that trend has continued and increased post-shutdown and post-COVID-19. Okay, next slide. So these next charts will give us a sense of the trends in the U.S. in terms of dollar volume and count. Dollar volume at the top and count at the bottom. As you may know, transactions above $5 billion create a large percentage of total value in the overall M&A market. However, there are relatively few number of those transactions. And while transactions under $100 million are a relatively small portion of total value, they are 60 to 70% of total count. And here you can see the trend going back to 2010. So if we take a look here just at Q1 and Q2 of 2020, we can see that transactions under 100 million were the category that were most affected by the shutdown and by COVID-19, both in terms of total value and transaction count. Next slide, please. And looking broadly, we can see that the mean transaction value of M&A transactions pulled back slightly. Now, this number is, again, including transactions all the way up to 5 billion plus. So that average is skews towards larger transactions. But you can clearly see there that the mean has begun to pull back, which is against the long-term trend that showed there in that chart. Next slide, please. Okay, these charts are a composition of U.S. M&A activity by industry. So again, dollar volume on top and the transaction count on the bottom. You can see the long-term trends of materials and resources, IT, healthcare, financial services, energy, business to consumer, and B2B. You'll see the counts of these transactions over a long term are pretty consistent, pretty similar distribution there. IT, healthcare, and energy tend to have the greatest fluctuations based on their market timing. You'll also notice a significant change, however, from Q1 to Q2 of 2020, most notably seeing an explosion in IT in terms of transaction value. Okay, next slide. Just as Josh had a good news slide on the Houston economy, here's the good news slide on mergers and acquisitions. This chart shows private equity add-on investments as a portion of their total investments. The takeaway for this slide is that private equity is continuing a long-term trend of consolidating add-on acquisitions for platform investments. For anyone who's interested in transactions under 100 million, this trend is particularly important and positive for that category. Next slide. Following on with that, another long-term positive trend is this chart here that's called the private equity capital overhang. And to define that a little more closely, capital overhang is the cumulative amount of capital that's dedicated to private equity funds for investing in businesses based on the fund's mandate. All of these funds, and you can see the particular vintages there by year, are waiting to be invested still as of the end of 2019. We believe that this is one of the most powerful influences in the lower middle market for mergers and acquisitions, and that this capital overhang will continue to have a significant influence on the M&A market and terms that favor sellers. So this will continue to move the market and be a significant influence in the market. So that's this 2.3 trillion that we're showing here at the end of 2019 is a significant strong influence in the market that will continue to be in favor of transactions under 100 million and sellers in mergers and acquisitions. Okay, next slide. I'll give a bit of our recent experience at B&V Capital Advisors. For one of our engagements that went under letter of intent in January of this year, after the shutdown and after the impact of COVID, the seller's revenue dropped from February to June on an order of 30% on a monthly basis. Adjusted EBITDA also dropped correspondingly 22%. And so in this particular instance, buyer, of course, raised valuation as an issue. And in this engagement, the seller and buyer renegotiated this letter of intent during that time period with an earnout used as the tool to address the valuation gap that was created during the shutdown period and during the impact of COVID as a way to bridge the valuation gap between seller and buyer, which is it's a tool we typically see, but just noting that that's our experience, that we've seen that applied very quickly during the shutdown period, and probably something that everyone can expect to continue, at least during this time where we have a shutdown. Next slide, please. So here are some potential risks and risk mitigants from a buyer's perspective that would be helpful to consider and keep top of mind. Buyers will consider these things very important, and it's been our experience as well that these are kind of top of mind for buyers during a period of shutdown or any period like we have now. First, of course, the all-inclusive decline in revenue. That's one that we've seen, particularly any drop in revenue. That's, of course, you're assessing the cause of that and which services or products are at risk or have had a significant change. Secondly would be an inability to reduce expenses. And third, what we've seen is closure to facilities or work sites, creating a significant impact and things that buyers consider risks and that they look for during this period of time. On the other hand, things that we have seen that influence buyers positively that are mitigants to those risks, any new lines of business that businesses can add, whether that's service or products, and of course, new product lines during this time that may be a lot to ask for, but to the extent you can offer a slightly different service or a slightly different product that goes to a different set of customers, buyers have looked on that very favorably. Any long-term contracts that are in place, we've seen those significantly mitigate the risk of drops in revenue. A dispersed workforce is, of course, something a buyer looks at as an important mitigant to any risk that they're experiencing from the business. And then one thing in particular we've also seen is if the business sells into insulated end markets, one example being public safety, that's something that buyers really look for. So next slide, please. Just a quick recap here. Total M&A transactions quarter over quarter in the U.S. are down 24% by count, and the total dollar volume of those transactions is down 41%. However, again, good news is long-term private equity capital overhang and the consolidation strategies are strong and continue through Q1 and Q2, and those persist. Buyers and sellers during this time are working to bridge valuation gap and using the earnout as a tool is what we've seen. A rebound in financial performance and mitigating factors create opportunities for transactions to continue and complete. So next slide. And so that's what I have prepared on mergers and acquisitions. And let's do the third polling question real quick. And the third question is, are you going to make a large capital investment in the next calendar year? And large is not defined, so we'll leave that up to you to decide. But either yes or no, a large capital investment in the next year. And Josh, we'll get ready here for some question and answer.
Okay, sounds good.
We can do maybe one.
I think there was one in the Q&A chat from Maryland.
Okay. Do you want to go ahead and jump on that one?
Sure. So Marilyn, you had asked if I could expand on the types of businesses and the categories in the last few graphs. So the graphs that I shared were about tech verticals. So the types of businesses that we tend to do well in terms of attracting venture capital funding in Houston are early stage. Let's say a scientist at Baylor Medical School has come up with a new way to a new gene therapy program. They will commercialize that company in a way that within 2 years you might not know that the company exists, and all of a sudden you see a $200 million investment for a company out of Houston that you've never heard of before. Oil and gas companies are using technology to let's say an engineer spins out of an oil and gas company because he's developed a new app that can solve some problem in the logistics space, or a consultant from McKinsey who's 50 years old and has been an executive for 30 years decides that he's going to start a company to use data science to solve oil and gas company problems. These are the types of companies that are doing well here. In TMC, there's a company called BVCA that's developed an artificial heart that is just a small company that's received about $20 million in VC funding that could change the world. These types of innovations are happening here. Austin does very well with consumer brands. Houston does not so much do as well with consumer brands. Dallas does very well with business-to-business IT problems, cloud computing, for example. Dallas does very well with that. So it's a little bit hard to kind of define because we do have companies, you can point to companies in Houston that do well, that break the mold. But as a trend, it is more kind of PhD type problems that are being solved here. Does that answer the question?
I think that was good, Josh. And we've got one more as well for you.
Okay. Why will GDP be down 3% with unemployment at 20%? The idea here is that, well, first of all, GDP will likely be down greater than 3%. So GDP by the International Monetary Fund standard for the U.S., they're projecting 8% drop in GDP. The U.S. Budget Office is projecting more like a 5% drop. In the second quarter, it was down 32%. So it's not 3% right now. It could get back up to only being down 5 to 8% if those returns that we went through with Houston's economy, how even though we'd experienced 350,000 jobs lost, we also recovered pretty quickly 100,000 of those. So that's a thing that could happen nationally that we experience. We are going to see growth from that low point over the next 2 quarters. So it could bring us back up to only being down 8% or 5%, if that makes sense.
Okay, thank you, Josh. I think, let's see, we need to see let's take a look at the answers for the third question poll. Okay, looks like we have maybe 20% that are considering a large capital investment in the next year. So that's a interesting outcome there. So let's see. So we're going to take a short 3-minute break as we end the session and we get ready for our keynote with Harry Mosley. Josh, thank you again for your data and your great presentation. Harry's going to be presenting the keynote and sharing with us how Zoom has emerged as a major player in the new economy. The link is in your PDF, but thanks again to Josh and thank you for coming.